Okay, well, good afternoon, and welcome to this meeting of the League of Women Voters of Champaign County. I'm Barbara Wysocki, the past president of this organization, and I will be serving as your moderator for today's topic, which has to do with ranked voting. Ranked voting is an alternative system of voting which is gaining popularity in a number of communities and states throughout the country. Ben Chapman, our speaker today, will explain why this method is being adopted and the advantages that this system holds over the more traditional system that we're all accustomed to. Ben is a senior at the University of Illinois, majoring in food science, human nutrition, and environmental sustainability. He was a media developer for the John Ebel campaign for Congress, and he himself has run for a seat on the Champaign County Board. He's currently a writer, reporter for the Mahomet newspaper, and president of Illinoisans for Ranked Choice Voting. This afternoon, he will be assisted by James Manrique. And following their presentation, we'll have time for questions from our small but very wise audience.
All right, thank you. Is this mic working? Just closer, good, farther, here? Okay. All right, thanks. So thank you for coming. I know that I'm always happy to spend an hour talking on end about the ins and outs of, sort of unknown electoral reforms, and I'm glad to see that other people are at least initially interested in listening. So on the way here today, I like to think of myself as a pretty mild-mannered, pretty cool-headed guy. But I was listening to Rush Limbaugh, and he was talking about the Electoral College and its incredible value to the United States. He was basically talking about the National Popular Vote Compact and about how there are certain people in the electoral reform activism sphere who are trying to undermine the Electoral College. And his radio show, in this particular case, was filled with things he happened to leave out, filled with misrepresentations of facts, and his conclusion was that the only way that we could possibly represent America, the American populace in a presidential election was through the Electoral College as it currently sits. Now, am I allowed to ask questions to the audience? Does that work, or does that not show up too well? All right, as a warm-up question, just to get thinking outside of the box, because that's how I arrived at this location in ranked choice voting. Why do we have two senators? Does anyone know why we have two senators? Not why we have a Senate. Why do we have specifically two senators?
I know why.
Representation for each state.
So that's for each state, but why did we choose two? Why not three? Why not one? Why not five? Why not 10? What is the magic number? What is the magic, evidence-based reason for choosing two? And then what is the magic evidence-based reason for saying those two senators should also go into our Electoral College? Does anyone know the answer to that? So I'll be honest, I've looked and I don't know the answer either. And that's the sort of question that helped me arrive at this spot. We talk about the Electoral College as if it's a reasonable thing that was developed, way back by these very intelligent founders. But in reality, it's tough to really explain some of the answers once we dig into the depths of it. And why did we decide on the number of people that should be represented by a congressperson? Why is it that we have settled on 750,000 people per congressperson? Why that number? Why not 500,000? Why not 1 million? And when you dig into the research there's a reason. And there's actually, there was an amendment that was attempted to be passed way back in the Bill of Rights that would have set a number for this. And that number was vastly lower than it is today. But the point I'm trying to get at is all these things, when we look at our government and how it's set up the way it is and why the way it's set up the way it is, a lot of them are arbitrary. a lot of them are not evidence-based. And with that, I want to talk about our current system. First past the post voting is what we call our current system. That's the only time I'll throw that word at you. It's called first past the post voting. That's where we are now. And I want to move us to ranked choice voting. So I guess a bit more introduction. I guess my font is going to be different here, but my friend Nathan Pulowski sent me this tweet. He said he wants to add ranked choice voting to this list. This is a tweet by Public Citizen basically talking about all the problems that they see in the electoral system. Automatic voter registration is needed, early voting, better early voting, registration for younger people, restore, I'm assuming that's the Voting Rights Amendment, Voting Rights Act. Felon disenfranchisement, gerrymandering, overturning Citizens United, public financing, and making Election Day a federal holiday. Can I just get a show of hands? Who thinks that this list roughly sounds like a decent grocery list of? Okay. I would also add the Electoral College to it. Maybe some rules on dark money and stuff, but this is a nice grocery list. And I'm sure as members of the League of Women Voters, you look at this and see there's a lot of work we got to do. There's a lot. So I'm just asking you to add one more thing, which is ranked choice voting. Who, by show of hands, has heard of this before? Okay, so it's been heard of before. Anybody ever used it in an election? Nobody? All right, well, I'll explain how it works then. How ranked choice voting works. Man, this font is strange. Okay, so I'm much more of a stand up and talker kind of guy, but I'll explain this with my hands sitting down. Voters, as it sounds, they rank their candidates in order of their favorites. You walk into a ballot booth and it's like you're ranking your favorite Star Wars movies or favorite Harry Potter books or whatever it is. You say one is, my favorite is, let's go back to the 2016 election. My favorite is Hillary Clinton. My second favorite is Bernie Sanders. My third favorite is, who else ran in that? Jim Webb. And then all the first votes are tallied. So at first, your second and third choices are ignored. And only the first choice is paid attention to. If of all of those first choice votes, one candidate has over 50% or a majority of those votes, that candidate wins. It's pretty simple. But if no candidate has over 50% or a majority, then the lowest candidate, the lowest vote getter, is eliminated. And the votes that did go to that candidate instead go to the second choices of those voters. So that's what's called a runoff, where you take the last place candidate and eliminate them, and then their votes will go to those voters will have to find a new candidate, and it just goes to the second ranked choice. Then if still no candidate has over 50%, you do another runoff, eliminate the next bottom candidate, and see if now a candidate has a majority. Am I making sense? Because if I'm not making sense, this is the explanation, nothing else will make sense. Good? Good, okay.
Voters aren't coming back and re-voting, no.
No.
They just rerun the numbers.
Exactly. So you have, the ballot looks like this. So you'd go in and you'd mark, say you love Lake Calhoun, you mark the circle by Lake Calhoun. That's your first choice. Then you go to your second choice, where that big 2 is. You'll mark by maybe Diamond Lake is your second favorite choice. And then your third favorite choice is Shingle Creek. Now, some ballots will have more than 3 choices. You can go down to 5, 6, 7, 8 different rankings, but at a certain point, it kind of doesn't matter as much. So this is an example of 3, which is what I've heard. Yeah.
If you had 4, the lowest one would go to the second or to the third? If you had 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're going to move the lowest person, you're going to eliminate the number 4, does that person's votes go to number 3 or go to number 2?
So,
One up, or
no, I'm sorry. So let's say I vote for Lake Calhoun first. So at first, all the first choice votes are counted. So it doesn't matter who you vote for second and third in the first round of counting. We'll call them rounds of counting. It's basically you're holding, 4 or 5 elections in one ballot. That's kind of a strange way of explaining it. Do you have a better way?
Yeah, it's like so it's the first choice that you look at. So once you vote, if nobody gets over 50%, then you drop off the first. If your first choice was not the winner, if your first choice only got like 5% of the vote, you drop that off, and then you go to the second choice, and then down. So it's kind of like the opposite, I think, because you were starting at 4 and working up. I think you
Yeah.
start at 1 and work down.
Okay, what do you do if you only have two candidates, like for the presidential thing? And a lot of people in our divided society would only vote, let's say, for Trump, or only vote for Joe Biden. What do you do then? Because then you can't move votes.
Then it doesn't matter. The thing is there's usually a write-in spot. I would argue that the write-in spot usually doesn't gain enough votes to matter. So in that case, we could use our current system. But the key thing that we'll get to later is presidential elections are very prone to having third-party candidates that have an effect. If you think back to 2000, actually, if you think back to any presidential election, there's always blame cast on third-party candidates for spoiling the election.
And there could be in 2020 as well.
I would almost 100% sure say, because there's already one candidate who's said they're a centrist independent, who Democrats are vilifying right now. And quite frankly, I'm vilifying him too, because he's a centrist independent billionaire who hasn't endorsed ranked choice voting, which would have saved him, which is one of the best ways for him to get a chance. But that's for, we'll get to that later. The process made clear? Okay, so.
Does this system suggest that party labels are not important?
This system could be used in a variety of ways that would drastically reduce the need to belong to a party, the effect of belonging to a party, and the strength of belonging to a party. So it's a big step away from party labels. I could say that. But there's no reason it would have to abolish the two-party system. It would just drastically weaken it. The thing that we can talk about later on is we wouldn't have to hold primaries anymore under this system. We especially wouldn't have to hold partisan primaries, because you're essentially explaining what you believe in one ballot. You know, you're telling people how you feel about all the candidates at one time. So this system, you don't need to go to the ballot booth a second time. And we'll talk about that more later on when we get into the examples and how ranked choice voting would have affected particular cases.
But wouldn't that give you a huge number of people to vote for? That would really...
Yes. So in some cases, it might not work out so great. So in the case of a presidential election, when you might have 20 candidates, it makes it a little bit clunky. But when you look at situations like what happened in Chicago, where you had 15 candidates for mayor on the ballot anyway, and voters are only able to go in and choose one, and the winner of the runoff election, or not the runoff election, the winner of the April, what was the date? It was the primary, I guess, yeah, it's called. The winner of the primary only got 16.5% of the vote, or maybe 17.5% of the vote. Now, that's not a big mandate. That's 17.5% is not a lot of the vote. So I'm getting ahead of myself here, but if you imagine in Chicago, if 17.5% of the people in Chicago happen to be, crazies, and they all unified behind one candidate, that candidate would get, would move ahead to the runoff election. Now, that doesn't represent Chicago, but that's because of the artifact of our current system, where we don't have this ranked voting system. That could happen. It hasn't, to my knowledge, been a huge problem, but it's theoretically possible. So here we'll get into some more examples of how ranked choice voting really would have had an effect, or in this case, how it did have an effect. Who heard about the Maine congressional race? Bruce Poliquin and Jared Golden. All right, this was a big victory for ranked choice voting fans. For those who don't know, Maine actually uses ranked choice voting statewide now. And so this was one of the first in recent history congressional races using ranked choice voting.
Wasn't it also the first time that they tried it, like in Maine? Like it was one of the first elections to use it in Maine?
Yeah, yeah. So this eventually resulted in a court battle where the judge decided very, very strongly in favor of ranked choice voting because, well, for reasons we'll explain here. But so as you can see, this is what's called a Sankey diagram. Who's familiar with Sankey diagrams? Does this make any sense to any? Okay, it doesn't make any sense. All right, so on the left of the screen, over on the on the side that you'd start reading on, you have all of the candidates and their first round vote totals. So as I was talking about, when you go into to vote, you pick your first choice, and that is your first round. And then eventually, votes from other people whose candidates have been eliminated through the runoffs, those votes will transfer to the candidates who are more close to victory. So you can see there's sort of a line going from Tiffany Bond up into Bruce Poliquin's red bar. You can also see a line from Will Hoare, who's the purple, go into Bruce Poliquin's total. So what's essentially happening there is the people who voted for Tiffany Bond first, they didn't get their first choice. Tiffany Bond got eliminated, and so they're instead getting their second choices. So the story of this election is Bruce Poliquin's team won with, I think, about 43% of the vote to Jared Golden's 42%. But that was before the ranked choice voting method had been taken into account. So Bruce Poliquin's team, the Republican, they're all celebrating that they won a congressional seat. But after the counting was finished and Tiffany Bond and Will Hoare, after their votes all were distributed to their second place choices, Jared Golden won. Because what was happening was Tiffany Bond and Will Hoare, both of those candidates were on the left side of the political spectrum. So they were essentially pulling from the same bank of voters as Jared Golden. And without ranked choice voting, Jared Golden wouldn't have gotten those votes, but because ranked choice voting existed, those votes went to Mr. Golden, and he's now the congressperson for Maine's, I believe, second or third district. So Bruce Poliquin wasn't happy about this. He said, we're going to take you to court over this, and the judge said, he brought up a few complaints that we can talk about later in the question answer portion in the nitty-gritty about this. But the judge said, actually, you know what, this is how the system was supposed to work. This is a reasonable electoral system that makes sense with the U.S. Constitution. It makes sense with Maine's Constitution, and we're going to stand by the outcome of this system. So that's one example of how ranked choice voting would have helped in a general election. Now we get into a fascinating case. San Francisco. San Francisco in 2018. I was lucky enough to be there during this election, and I got to sort of watch how this went down. Take a look at this diagram because it takes a second to digest. The main things you have to look at are Kim, Leno, and Breed. They were the three frontrunners. Now you'll see, is there a mouse? Yes, okay. Can you all see this mouse?
Yeah.
Okay. You'll see this big part right here when Kim gets eliminated. So you see you start off with all these candidates, and over time these smaller ones get eliminated, and then Kim is the last one to go, and her votes split massively for Leno. Whoops. Massively for Leno.
No, I don't know if that helps.
Oh yeah, thank you. Okay, there's Jane Kim, and her votes are splitting for Leno. You can see by the width of the bar there. Now, why did that happen? Because Jane Kim and Mark Leno campaigned together. They actually built up a coalition. They said to each other, hey, we are both progressives. We have the same issues we care about. We're talking about the same issues. So why fight? We both pull from the same bank of voters, so we agree on things. Let's not fight it out. Let's team up. They shared literature. They shared events. They shared fundraising. They built a coalition, a progressive coalition. And you can see that if they hadn't done that, neither of them would have come close to beating London Breed, who is in the orange. But because they built up the coalition, they came very close. It would have been Mark Leno who slightly outdid Jane Kim, and then once Kim was eliminated, then Leno became the runner-up just barely to London Breed. Now, while it was by like a minuscule percentage of a vote how close this race was. But you can see how what's happening here is that these two candidates are teaming up. That is unheard of in today's politics. That is unheard of. The reason is because if this election were run under our current system, Kim and Leno would have been polling from the same bank of voters. And they'd have to fight it out. They would have to work exceptionally hard to distance themselves from each other, even though they agree. They would have artificially dug for dirt on their opponent, and they would have started mudslinging campaigns to prove that they're the real progressive, or to prove that the other person's unfit for office, because that's the only way to do it. You have to under our current system. So when I see people talk about how we have to change our politics to reduce mudslinging, I say, you should really get behind ranked choice voting. We can say to political candidates, hey, even though it works out well for you, you should just try to be a little bit nicer. You should just be a little bit more polite. They're not going to do that. I know politicians. They're not going to be nice just to make you happier. They're going to be mean because our current system forces them to be mean. In fact, it forces them to be mean with people that they agree with. That's not how this is supposed to work. We talk in politics all the time about this idea of bringing people together. I swear I hear it in every single speech ever. What is your strength? Oh, I just really am great at bringing people together. What does that mean, though? Ranked choice voting is a system that is specifically designed to reward candidates who bring people together. So that's especially why it's something that I think that independents and people who want a more civilized discourse should get behind. Now, I have to tell you why ranked choice voting might be bad. This is getting a little bit into the weeds again, but ranked choice voting ignores some second place votes. So suppose in this case I had voted for Mark Leno, and then my second place choice was Jane Kim. Now, my first place vote gets counted, and that's great. I'm totally fine with that because I got my first choice. I'm happy. Mark Leno won. I'm thrilled. But I also kind of supported Jane Kim. But the voting count never shows that. So my second place choice never gets heard. As a voter, I'm happy, but as Jane Kim, I'm kind of like, well, I kind of got gypped there because, somebody out there supported me a little bit and, I didn't get the goods from that. So that's one criticism ranked choice voting suffers from. It's very marginal, though. That effect is marginal. RCV is more complicated. It's pretty simple to say, name your favorite Star Wars movie, that's easy. But rank your favorite Star Wars movies in order, that's a bit more of a difficult task. So RCV is complicated, and some people, there's a higher percentage of avoided ballots because of mistakes. Sometimes people are scared that it's more complicated, so voters can't understand how to use it. Now, I kind of think that politics is a really complicated thing to be part of, and deciding who to vote for is a really complicated thing, and ranking somebody is not difficult at all compared to figuring out who to vote for. So I don't think that effect is that powerful either, but it's a criticism that's leveled against RCV.
And in fact, that was the criticism that was levied against it when it was tried in Urbana 10 years ago. That was the same criticism that they used to try to defeat it, was that it would be too complicated, and because of that, it would disenfranchise people. But you can see that that's not the case with Santa Fe and Maine and other places that have used it.
Yeah, and as it's used more often, people get the hang of it, which is why it's starting local. We're trying to educate people about how to use it on a local scale. And then RCV takes longer to count, so you've got more complex ballots, and it's sometimes a bit more expensive to count that election. Although I should be clear that there are ways that it can be used that make it less expensive, and we can get into that more. The good, I'll just go over this because we've talked about it a little bit already. RCV promotes majoritarian support. You can't win an RCV, ranked choice voting RCV election, if you don't have over 50% of the vote. In our current system, you can win with 2 votes is all it takes. If there are only, if you get the most votes, if you only have 2 votes, you win. That's an exaggeration, but as you can see, it happens with, Lori Lightfoot in Chicago and Tony Preckwinkle. They got 17.5 and 16%. So RCV discourages negative campaign and it encourages coalition building. RCV empowers voters. It gives them more voice in their political system. RCV minimizes strategic voting, vote splitting, and vote spoiling because you aren't forced to vote for a lesser evil. You don't have to worry about your vote not counting because let's say you love the Green Party. Even if you love the Green Party, you might feel, oh, I have to vote for Hillary Clinton because I really don't like Donald Trump. So even though I love the Green Party, I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton because it's strategic, because Hillary Clinton actually has a chance. With RCV, you can rank your Green Party candidate first, and then Hillary Clinton second, and then Donald Trump, you can just leave him off the ballot if you don't like him. And then RCV fits American voting culture. And I'll explain this just shortly because it's interesting to me. I believe in this theory called voting culture. There's a way we think about how we vote. We look for certain things in a candidate, but there's a lot of psychology that goes into actually filling in that bubble. And in America, we believe in very strongly this idea of one person, one vote. And ranked choice voting exhibits that. You rank candidates, but your vote only goes to one candidate at a time. You never have more than one vote. Ranked choice voting also doesn't exhibit a later no harm flaw. Has anyone heard of this flaw before? The later no harm? Okay. Since I'm in a room of election nerds also, I'll go into it just because I think it's interesting. Later no harm means that if I support, let's go back to the 2016 election again. If I support Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Martin O'Malley, in that order, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Martin O'Malley. When I walk into the ballot booth, I don't want to give Martin O'Malley any support if it's going to hurt Hillary Clinton's chances. So if you were to give Martin O'Malley, if you were to vote for all 3 of them, in which you can do in some proposals for voting, you would essentially be giving Martin O'Malley a vote that could give him an edge up on Hillary Clinton. But you don't want to help Martin O'Malley because you believe in Hillary Clinton more. So it's called later no harm because you're giving support to a candidate you don't fully support, and you would prefer Hillary Clinton over Martin O'Malley, but you're throwing your first choice at risk through your voting method. That may have made sense, it may not have made sense, but we can talk about it. Yeah, sorry. You can go look it up at home if you want. It's a fascinating thing, and it's something that election nerds get into a lot with what system they're talking about. Should we talk about the specific cases or go into questions more? Specific. Okay. All right. So where would ranked choice voting have helped? This is where the rubber meets the road. One thing that the instance that keeps coming up to the front of my mind is the 2000 presidential general election, where voters for Gore and Nader kind of split. In fact, Ralph Nader is somewhat blamed for handing the election to George Bush. Now, does Ralph Nader support George Bush? I don't, from my understanding of what happened in that election, Ralph Nader and George Bush were politically very different. But he's blamed for handing the election to George Bush. Why? Just because he happened to agree with Al Gore. So in ranked choice voting, what would have happened is likely many of Ralph Nader's voters would have ranked Al Gore second. And the result would have been that once Nader was eliminated, Gore would have had a better chance at winning the election. And we wouldn't, people wouldn't hate Ralph Nader. He didn't do anything wrong, we should be clear. He ran for election as we are allowed to in the United States of America. But he's blamed because of an artifact of our electoral system. Looking at the 2016 Republican presidential primary, it's my contention that if we had ranked choice voting in the Republican primary in 2016, we would not have a President Trump right now. The reason for that, we had this one candidate who was much, way far out there in terms of the current political atmosphere. And then like 12 or 13 other candidates who were sort of more mainstream, more electable, more palatable candidates. The reason Donald Trump was able to get through, in my opinion, the reason he was able to get through that primary was because these more, I use rational tongue-in-cheek, but mainstream, yes. These more mainstream candidates all split up. They all split their votes. Well, Donald Trump got all the Tea Party folks behind him. That's how that happened, in my view. So seeing that, RCV would have really affected how this would have worked. I already talked about the Chicago mayoral election, 17.5% and 16%. Those are not mandates. Those are not the numbers that we should be electing our candidates with. When people say, I feel like nobody in politics really represents me, and then I look at those numbers, I'm like, yeah, there's a chance that nobody in politics represents you just because we have such a weird electoral system. Looking at the Illinois gubernatorial race where we had 6 candidates, and there was this very strong anti-Pritzker sentiment. The problem was Mr. Pritzker was a very powerful candidate who ended up taking 40% of the vote. Meanwhile, there was sort of these 5 other candidates and this anti-Pritzker mentality that was split up between these 4 or 5 candidates.
When in that same election, you also had the
Attorney General's race.
Attorney General of Illinois, and was there one other one that had a bunch of people running?
I don't know. The AG's race had like 9 candidates in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
the person that won that won with like 25%.
yeah, that's not a mandate. 25% is not a mandate. That's not enough to say that I represent this population. And then moving forward, and this is where I want you all to do something for me. Watch as the 2020 election unfolds. Watch for any point where you see these dozens of candidates talking and you say, hey, I kind of support this one. I also support this one. I also support this one. And you think, hey, ranked choice voting would help me out here with making my choice. Because there's a chance that somebody's going to get through the 2020 Democratic primary with a very small amount of support from the Democratic Party, ranging from 20, 30, 40%, and that's not a mandate. So thank you for listening to me ramble on and on about ranked choice voting. And I'm sure you're dying to ask some questions about. Yes.
Well, this is probably a good spot to stop and pause and allow people to kind of raise the issues that are already lingering, I'm sure. Anyone want to start off?
So how do communities or states or get from what we have to ranked choice voting? What are the transition steps?
It usually happens through smart organizing through nonprofits. First off, you have to look at the state's constitution to see if it's something that's allowed. But then the way that it's actually implemented from an activist point of view is you start locally. In Illinois, there are no cities that use it yet, but I think there's like 20 or 30 cities around the U.S. of varying sizes, of varying political affiliations and leanings that use it, and that's by design. The nonprofit Fair Vote is going to small towns and sometimes big cities like San Francisco and now in Chicago to try to enact RCV legislation and stuff so that people will get used to using it. Because, you look at us too, and we really care about educating voters, but, quite honestly, we're nothing compared to how crazy that some of these other electoral reform activists are about making sure people get to the polls. We don't want ranked choice voting to make people confused. We really don't. So educating people is step one. Coming to talk and have this conversation, that's part of the effort. So yeah, starting locally and slowly growing the momentum to larger tasks.
Are there any countries anywhere that have used this method?
There are.
Yes.
Ireland has used it for 100 years to elect their president. Yes.
Yeah, and I believe Australia and New Zealand also use a form of it. Again, things get messy when you say exactly what system they use. Sometimes they use like multi-winner methods where they have a proportional system, and that's a whole other beast. But they use a ranked choice ballot to cast their votes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Ireland's been doing it for 100 years.
Yeah, we're not new to this. This isn't a new issue. This has been, it's used very commonly in other places, just not in the U.S.
I think they also use it sometimes in college campuses for like student voting for what do you call it, like the student body president, that sort of stuff. They use it there often.
Yeah.
So why hasn't this caught on?
Because it does not help the establishment candidates. So often the establishment candidates don't want to support it because it diminishes their ability to, get those votes. Because you have a lot of those candidates that win their positions with, that 40%. But, like you showed, the conservative didn't win in Maine because it was able to be split up. And I think that is a lot of the pushback. I mean, that was the pushback. That was the pushback that was seen in Urbana 10 years ago when it was tried on the local level in Urbana, was that the establishment politicians at that time did everything in their power to not have that happen because it was going to diminish their ability to maintain their offices.
Yeah, candidates are reluctant to change a system that got them to the power that they have. But even more than that, like you mentioned, this is a strong anti-machine, the two-party system mechanism. Ranked choice voting is very effective at breaking down the two-party system and very effective at destabilizing political machines. And I'm not sure if you've tried this ever, but going up against a political machine and a two-party system is a very difficult thing to do in some places. So yeah, that's one of the reasons. That's our tinfoil hat reason.
I mean, it's just the truth, though.
It's
the
truth.
establishment candidates in town did everything in their power to stop it when it was raised 10 years ago. So I'm sure that happens in other areas as well.
So does this mean that for this system to work on the national level, that every state in the union would have to adopt this?
That's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure on the answer, but I can say that let me ask a little bit more. Do you mean by working on the national level as in presidential elections?
Right.
Yeah, so for that, it would have to be each state because it's my understanding that the states decide how they're going to allocate
Right.
their electors. So then it would have to be every state.
And if some states had this system and others did not, then it would mean that national candidates would have a hard time figuring out what states they need to carry to get the electoral count. Which is, and frankly, and which states they can leave out. They don't have to visit, they don't have to campaign in, they don't have to put the money, the resources, the people to do good. Is that
You bring up a good point. Polling with this sort of system would be totally different.
totally, almost impossible, wouldn't it?
Not impossible, but because you could still ask, hey, what's your first, second, and third choice for this office? You could still ask that. It would just be a little bit more complex. But so from a politically strategic point of view, candidates would spend more time trying to figure out what coalitions they have to build, what friendships they have to make, what issues they have to talk about. More time doing that than spending time saying, okay, I'm polling poorly in Mississippi, let's spend another $100,000 down there in ad buys. That's what I think the outcome would be. Does that answer your question, or am I kind of leaving it
I was going to
unanswered?
say, too, the interesting thing with the national election system is that there's not necessarily a national election system. The whole election system is really broken down on the state and the local level. Every state has It's up to them how they want to run their own elections. And then a lot of times it's also up to each individual city and each individual municipality how they want to run their own elections. So there's a lot of decentralization in the voting system, which is actually good because it makes it more secure. But so there's not really a real cohesive national voting system, as it were. So I don't know if that helps explain it more so.
I'd add to this that another interesting thing about the national election system is that it's really, really, really bad. The Electoral College is a mess as it currently is used. So we can try to put like a Band-Aid on it with using ranked choice voting, but that won't fix the mess that exists right now.
Well, and nationally, really the only thing that you choose nationally is the president. That's really the only thing that you vote on a national level anyways. And then that voting is, I mean, that's still different from state to state. You know, some states have, what is that, instead of voting, they do the thing where they all get together in a room. What's that
caucus.
Called? Caucus, yeah. Some states caucus, some states do different ways of determining their presidential person. So, yeah, maybe that explains more.
I just wanted a clarification. Did you say that the Illinois Constitution as it now stands, ranked choice voting would be possible?
It's my understanding that it would be. I'm not a lawyer, but from the people I've talked to and from looking at the bills that have been proposed, Senator Daniel Biss proposed a bill. He's one of the main supporters of ranked choice voting, who's unfortunately no longer in the legislature, so we can't talk to him about this and get him to do it. I believe Representative Guzzardi is also in support of it. But I should say there have been bills introduced. We have no reason to believe it wouldn't be possible. Springfield currently uses it for overseas ballots. I'm pretty sure that's like
true. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very small number of ballots actually use ranked choice voting. So, but that's enough for me to say that ranked choice voting would be possible in Illinois under the current Constitution.
So if it were to be used locally, how, let's say Champaign, city of Champaign, who decides? Is it a vote, or does the county clerk decide, or how does it, what is the authority that says we're now doing ranked choice voting locally?
For Urbana, which is the one I know the most because I sat at this table and we talked to Urbana, the Urbana city government would have, from my understanding, the final say. We'd have to talk a lot to the county clerk before that actually happened. But yeah, that's basically how it would work. It would take a lot of cooperation with the county clerk because we'd be asking him to do something that nobody else in Illinois has done yet. So.
But the city council could just mandate, now we're doing, it doesn't require a vote of the population.
Oh, that's a good question.
And I think that kind of gets into the decentralized nature of voting because every municipality has their own rules on voting. So I think it really depends on the individual municipality. So I haven't done a lot of research on Champaign or Urbana specifically. I know that we worked on Urbana a little bit, and it seemed like they were saying that we needed to go through the city council to get it done. Other places you might be able to go just straight to the city clerk. Some places you might need a referendum. I think it depends on the specific city and like how their election code is set up. So like, you know, we were working with the Urbana people for a while, but.
One thing I can bring up that might answer your question a bit or might explain why I'm unable to answer your question is that a type of resolution that's been passed before in Santa Fe was to say, if it ever becomes feasible to use ranked choice voting, we must use it. That was passed back in the mid-2000s, and only now is Santa Fe starting to use ranked choice voting. And that's partly because of the disclarity of the word feasible. The end result was feasible was decided to mean, what is expense-wise reasonable, and can we actually pull this off? So what I think we would have to do if we were to get this done in Urbana was we'd have to do something similar to that. We'd have to say, okay, we're going to pass this resolution maybe through a vote of the citizens of Urbana and through the city council to say, hey, Mr. Ammons, we know this is going to be tough, but just let us know when you can get this set up, when you have the budget to do this. And, I mean, I know that the county is a bit strapped for cash sometimes, so it might take a bit, but that's how it would have to go. I think it's worth it for our democracy, though. Like, for the sake of our electoral system, I will stop at nothing. But
Well,
you know, other
and
people-
you mentioned that it just happened in Santa Fe recently. Santa Fe is a great example because in Santa Fe, they recently put up a video online about the election that they had with ranked choice voting, where they actually talked to the politicians that were in that election, that were running for that election. They also talked to the city staff that was involved with running the election, and pretty much everybody across the board thought that it was a positive. The candidates talked about how campaigning was a lot more positive. They were talking to the middle of the issues. One of the big things is that when knocking on doors, sometimes if you run across somebody that's already, their vote's already decided, they're voting for the other guy. A lot of times in traditional elections, that stops your door knock, you just move on to the next house. In ranked choice voting, you can say to that person, you can be like, hey, I know that you're interested in this guy. I agree with that guy on A, B, and C, but I also have this other idea. So, I agree with him on a lot of things. You might consider putting me for number 2. So it makes campaigning more effective for them because they aren't, just wasting their time with X number of voters. So that video in Santa Fe was a real good promotion for how it can work, it worked across the board for them, I think, so.
Specifically, what new demands does this put on a county clerk's office?
They'll need to retool the machines because you got to redo the ballots a little bit different. From what I understand, our ballots locally can handle it because with Scantron machines, you can have like 2-dimensional ballots where you have the box where you can go across. And from what I understand, our machines can do it. It's just retooling and reprogramming the machines to make them understand the ballots.
vote counting will take a bit longer. It's a bit more of a demand. But if we think back to the Urbana has a primary system. There's a primary, then a general election. Under ranked choice voting, we could, in Urbana, eliminate the primary. So that's a whole election that Urbana wouldn't have to deal with anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that would
Well,
massively
And that
alleviate
would,
some burden.
that would generate some savings that could be
Yeah.
applied
Exactly.
to whatever expenses this system.
Exactly.
I got you, okay.
And there's oftentimes, there are some times when there just aren't enough candidates to warrant a primary or, to eventually warrant RCV. But in the case where there is, there are enough candidates, RCV could come into play and save us some money. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too, is that you don't have to, it doesn't change every election. It only changes elections where you have more than 2 candidates. So any election where there's 2 candidates, everything's still just the same it was.
Well, it seems to me that in recent years, with when we don't hand count ballots anymore, there seems to be a pressure on election commissions, county clerks, whoever, wherever those ballots go, to have results in that same night.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of waiting a day or 2, or in the case of, South Carolina, it took them 2 weeks.
Oh, wow. Well, I think in theory it shouldn't take that much longer to actually count them because it's still a computer doing it and the computer can just
Yeah,
tally it up just as fast as anything, I would imagine. I would imagine hand counting might be a bit more difficult, obviously, but if you're doing it through a machine, it should still just be just as quick as computers can count things.
It takes a bit longer. To me, I don't see that as much of a con. But I'm also somebody who's kind of frustrated that our politics have become sort of like sports. People want drama. People want everything right away. Ranked choice voting is adding some rationality back to the system. And part of that, if we have to wait some time to make sure that the votes are counted properly, I feel like that's a fair thing to ask. Let's make sure our democracy works before we report on the winners.
So ranked choice voting wouldn't necessarily eliminate the Electoral College. Those are 2 separate issues.
They're 2 separate things.
It could, but that's not.
It couldn't replace, implementing ranked choice voting wouldn't abolish the Electoral College.
Okay.
It would change some of the mechanics of how people campaign in the Electoral College, but it wouldn't abolish it.
But it might make the argument to get rid of it a stronger one in the eyes of more people, perhaps?
Maybe. What I see happening is when people's eyes are really opened up to what actually good evidence-based elections can do, they'll see that the Electoral College is not evidence-based, or at least the Electoral College as it stands now is not evidence-based. So I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but the Electoral College, people argue for it because of its ability to give more power to swing states. The problem, or not swing states, to flyover states.
Yeah.
The problem is there are only 13 states that have any voice in the general election for the President of the United States. Only 13. And those are all swing states. They're the only states that are being heard. That's not an exaggeration. You can look at where the candidates are putting their money. They don't care about Illinois. They don't care about California. They don't care about Texas. They don't care about Wyoming. They don't care about, they don't even care about Iowa anymore. Iowa gets their fun in the primary, but they get ignored in the general election. Our electoral college system is creating an entire, 40-some states, 37 states that are flyover states. So don't fall for anyone who tells you that the Electoral College creates or eliminates flyover states. It just creates an entirely new set of them, a possibly even bigger set of them. So what I propose is either to completely abolishing the Electoral College or moving away from the winner-take-all. So it sounds very rational, but in Illinois we have 20 electoral votes. Doesn't it just make sense that if 60% go to the Democrat and 40% go to the Republican, that we give 60% of our electoral votes to the Democrat and 40 to the Republican? That is mathematically sound. It means that, Wyoming still has its 3 electoral votes, which make it stronger than its just 1. So Wyoming is no longer a flyover state, but it's still giving a rational amount of, it's eliminating the swing state problem. We shouldn't be giving this much power to Florida. I mean, nothing against Florida, but it's way too powerful.
Right.
So,
And just one other clarification. Would we be looking at one ballot that had Democratic and Republican candidates? We'd all have one ballot, and we would be ranked choicing, cross parties perhaps? Is that?
we could do either. We could have a primary. In the case of, maybe an Illinois or, Illinois-wide or countrywide election, it might make sense to have a ranked choice voting primary. And then I would still support a ranked choice voting general election, but the general election where there's usually just 2 candidates, it's not as necessary.
Right.
So you could do both. What you're asking sort of is, do we eliminate the primary system? And we could, or we don't have to.
And an individual voter could include Republicans and Democrats and independents within her rank.
Yeah. If we're eliminating the primary,
Yeah.
I see no reason in the logic of democracy that I, as a Democrat, shouldn't also be able to express my opinion about a Republican. If I don't like the idea that a 2-party system should be enforced by our electoral system.
Right.
It's not helping us. I have opinions about Republicans. Why can't I express them?
Sure, that's right.
So yeah, did you have anything to add?
Not really, but yeah, I mean, it's just like you said, it can be a plot. You can eliminate that primary if you want, or you can keep it there. Either way, you got versatility with it.
I was curious about the impact of, or if there's any kind of strategic voting that a voter can do. I mean, it occurred to me when you mentioned that there would be some candidates you wouldn't vote for. I mean, it's not like you're ranking everybody. You're only ranking some of them. You could only rank, I mean, if there's 4 choices on the ballot for first, second, third, fourth choice, I might only fill in the first and second. Are there impacts of that kind of, and is it strategic to leave out or not completely fill it out, or what happens when people vote that way?
It's weighted more, you mean?
Yeah, does it change the math?
Yeah, you don't benefit from leaving candidates off because if you rank your first 2 favorites and you don't get either of those, then you're already disappointed. So you might as well, try to stem the bleeding and, out of those last 2 of the 4, pick the one that you hate the least and rank them. But another thing that you kind of bring up is what does strategic voting look like under ranked choice voting? And it brought to my mind this great op-ed I read about the election in San Francisco, where they said, to remind you, it looks like I can't. But San Francisco was the one where those two candidates teamed up. And the op-ed said, San Francisco shows how to gamify or to strategically vote through the ranked choice voting system, and it proves that it's the best possible way to do it. Because strategic voting and strategic campaigning is actually good under the ranked choice voting system because people are teaming up. You're building coalitions. That's what it's about. It's about, finding the people you agree with and saying, I agree with you. That shouldn't be a punishment in our electoral system. So I don't know if that answers the question you're getting at. Is there anything that I can do to clarify?
Well, I'm just, thinking of scenarios like in our current system. I'm, say, a Democrat, and it's not that interesting. The Democratic primary is not that interesting to me, but there's some Republican that I just really want to vote against, or for, because I want them to be the one for my Democratic candidate to beat. So I go vote in the Republican primary. Are there,
as far as I understand, it doesn't
things like that could happen under this system where somebody?
As far as I understand, it doesn't introduce any new vectors for you call that strategic voting. I don't think it introduces any new methods of strategic voting that don't already exist under the current system. And it definitely eliminates the current strategic method. Like the current system, you have the spoiler candidate, that's the third party one, where currently the strategic voting is, I can't vote for this third party candidate because they can't possibly win, so I better vote for somebody that might have a chance. And so luckily with ranked choice voting, it eliminates that whole mess.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a lot of strategic voting that you can do with ranked choice voting, from what I understand.
No, but like the point you bring up is possibly the only way that somebody could strategically vote, by voting in another primary, by voting for the candidate who in the Republican primary if they're a Democrat, voting in the Republican primary for either the candidate that's least electable or the one that they least hate. Here are the three words that you should bring home with you. Hopes, not fears. It allows you to vote for your hopes, not your fears. You don't have to vote for somebody who you think is electable. You vote for who you really believe in. That's what ranked choice voting does. So it eliminates most strategic voting in that way.
Would the strategic voting eliminate the process in the primary where you go in and you declare? Because so many times I've gone in and I'm a Democrat, but I may want to vote for a couple of Republicans in the election. Would that completely be taken out of the picture? You would just go in and get a ballot?
If you eliminated the primary system, if you eliminate the primary, then yeah. Because there'd be no primary for you to vote in. But otherwise, if there still are partisan primaries, that would, that system would still be set up. And again, most ranked choice voting advocacy groups are very much for open primaries. So because the closed primary system is kind of a sin against democracy, honestly. So yeah. Does that answer your question? Yes. Okay.
I think we could almost do a part 2 to this topic and to other electoral reforms that we've sort of touched on. But I do want to thank you, Ben and James, for really maybe opening our minds a little bit to some other possibilities. I think we're off the air. Anyhow, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.